Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, a little bit away from the news forum, but still here online. And of course, the news forum is where all voices matter. A new Iron Curtain, a digital one, has fallen over Russia in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. What are the implications for Western nations? Here to discuss are Aaron Shull. He is the Managing Director and General Counsel to the Center for International Governance Innovation. And we also have Dr. Laura DeNardis. She is a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Tony.
So I guess I'll ask Laura first, if that's all right. Just maybe describe how this digital Iron Curtain is working.
Conflicts over digital technologies are really a new space where power has been unfolding in the world, and you certainly see it with the digital Iron Curtain around Russia. And it's unfolding in three different ways. One is internal to Russia, where the government itself is cracking down on social media usage and cracking down on journalists, of course. That there's no surprise there. What has been very interesting, though, is to see two other ways that the digital Iron Curtain has arisen. One is in external private companies pulling their services and products from Russia. And it happened in a very rapid, historic, and massive way, from Apple to TikTok to dating sites like Bumble, and very interestingly, network operators who have pulled out to a certain extent. So that's another way. And then a more obscure way that I think has captured a lot of people's attention because they may not have been aware of this area is in Ukraine's request to the institutions that run the internet to unplug Russia from the internet. So it led many people to say, do these institutions have the ability to unplug Russia by withdrawing IP addresses and interfering with the domain name system? And on that front, the institutions, including it's a couple of acronyms, ICANN is one of them and RIPE NCC is another, they made the decision not to pull the plug. So those are the three arenas, and it really has been rapid and massive to see all of the digital action.
Right. Aaron, what's your perspective on this?
Well, honestly, Tony, Laura and I did not compare notes before this discussion with you, but she hit the exact same 3 points in the exact same order that I was going to answer the question had I been asked first. Russia's doing what Russia does, right? They blocked Facebook, they blocked Twitter, they blocked Instagram. So Russia is clamping down. But at the same time, as Laura said, Western technology companies are unilaterally pulling out. So you've got everything from Airbnb to Apple changing their business practices, which is also part of this Iron Curtain. And then, as she said, I don't want to bore your listeners to death, but this thing ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, I know most people have never ever heard of this thing before. It is super important. It is literally the phone book that makes the internet work. The reason I can talk to you, Tony, is because my video gets broken into little bits and bytes, and it goes through the internet and it routes to you because of that phone book. And what they were asking to do, what Ukraine asked ICANN to do, was to unplug Russia from the phone book. They said no because they didn't want to set a political precedent. But all that to say, that's the tripartite mechanism that creates this digital Iron Curtain.
Gotcha. Aaron, is it at all possible to get non-Putin inspired information to Russians given this digital divide that's occurring?
Yes, I mean there's two mechanisms. One is through something called a virtual private network, or a VPN, which tries to route around some of these blockages. Now, I will also say this: Russia's cracking down on that as well too, right? So this is not a panacea. And the second is there are some instances where YouTube is actually the best example. YouTube is still largely up in Russia. I mean, Google just got fined for some anti-Putin content, but all that to say, YouTube is still up. So there are ways.
So I think it's important because there's, as you both mentioned, there are kind of a couple of things happening all at once. Do you expect that that's going to be the status quo? We've got about 30 seconds left, Laura, before the break. Is this the new status quo that what we're seeing now?
It's not only the new status quo, it's been happening for quite a long time. And you've seen these intermediary companies blocking information in a variety of ways, especially around the domain name system, but also cloud computing. You might recall when Amazon Web Services cut off Parler after the president's election, another example.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Aaron Shull. He is a managing director and general counsel to the Center for International Governance Innovation. We also have Dr. Laura DeNardis. She is a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Laura, when the West sort of switched off these internet connections, I'm maybe asking a political science question, and I'll ask both of you the same question, but when the West switched off these internal internet connections, did that actually help Vladimir Putin keep more control over the population? Is that one of the concerns?
The same exact technologies that can enable the free flow of information can repress it. And every instance of cutting off, one side of censorship is also control. It's also freedom. Values are always in tension. I think that some of it actually did help Putin. If you think that a site of resistance is actually the people in Russia and the ability of them to communicate maybe with family members in Ukraine and to get information from outside sources, then if you think about that as a point of resistance, then it doesn't make sense to cut off Russia. If you think about it from the standpoint of wanting to prevent the Russian government from promulgating propaganda outside of the borders, then it does make sense. So I think in some ways it did help Putin. In other ways, it helped the cause of freedom.
Aaron, what's your point of view on this?
Yeah, no, I think rather than kind of repeating Laura, I'll just riff off what she said. So there's the technical architecture that we've been discussing, but you had raised it in the context of politics. And there's law in Russia that goes at the heart of this, right? So they passed a fake news law that prohibits anyone talking about the Russian army. And so you've got the technical aspects where certain Western companies are pulling out. There's less platforms. There's also centralization of control in Russia of the platforms. So now they're watching everything that's going on in these platforms, and they're passing laws to limit speech with real teeth. Yeah, like jail time. Think jail time for coming up with a message that's contrary to what's coming out of the Kremlin right now. So certainly there's the technical architecture, there's the legal architecture, and then there's just the straight chilling effect that comes into play.
Yeah, there's you got to be pretty brave in Russia to stand up against that. I saw some video of a fellow who in some public square just recently knocked over a loudspeaker that was playing the Russian national anthem, and immediately was escorted out of sight by the police. So there are some brave souls in Russia, but it's just tough to do anything, given the current circumstances. I guess the broader question, Aaron, to you, that Laura also raised, was just how susceptible the internet is to government shutdowns. This seems to be a new area, and Laura mentioned that Ukraine Ukraine asked for a complete shutdown for Russia. ICANN said no, but this seems to be more and more a battlefield. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. And there's a few things that are happening here. So Russia passed something called the Sovereign Internet Law, and this did a few things. But part of it was, basically state control over these services, where they're bringing everything together, centralizing control with a view to monitoring what's going on and controlling that free speech that we talked about. They're also using it as a tool to throttle companies that are doing things that they don't like. So at the technical layer, this is all playing out. But this all is about routing internet traffic. And what Russia ultimately is probably going to try and do is create their own domain name system or their own Russian internet. We're looking at is what they call a splinternet. The internet was created to be interoperable, to have one worldwide web. And we are very, very quickly moving away from that model.
Laura, is this inevitable at this point?
It actually has a long history. It's been happening for a long time. I think the Egyptian internet outage is the best example of that. And that was quite a while ago. But just on a daily basis, there are many shutdowns of the internet. It's not always the free flow of information. And some of it is for law enforcement reasons. Some of it is for things like using the domain name system for intellectual property rights enforcement. It's not always just a geopolitical issue. But the big takeaway there is that even though the internet is decentralized, there are actually many different choke points where you can block information and take people down and take information down. And the mechanisms that you see around Russia and the digital sanctions is certainly a prime example of that.
We're going to continue our discussion with our two guests, talking about this new digital Iron Curtain. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Aaron Shull. He is of the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Dr. Laura DeNardis. She is professor at Georgetown University. Aaron, we're talking a lot about what's going on in Russia, but Russia is also exploiting the internet and our openness, such as it is, in Western society. Talk a little bit about how that exploitation is going on during this conflict.
Sure. So really what we're talking about is Russian cyber capabilities in this context. And Russia uses cyber capabilities in three ways. The first is during a war. As you will have seen in the Ukraine, they deployed cyber attacks against Ukrainian critical infrastructure. The second way that they're deploying cyber capabilities is what you would call a hybrid conflict. So it's not war, but it's just underneath, where it's aggressive and they're meddling. They're using cyber exploits against critical infrastructure in other countries that they're not in a hot conflict with. This is a good example. There was a warning from the CSE, or the Communications Security Establishment in Canada, that this was something that we needed to be live to. And the third is part of their diplomacy, if I could even call it that, but they'll use cyber attacks to signal certain things during a diplomatic row. And a good example is they hacked Global Affairs Canada. So it's during a war, just below war, where it's a kind of ongoing, persistent threat, and then just as part of their statecraft diplomacy.
Laura, what's your vantage point on this? Do you see more and more of this?
Russia is doing what Russia does in terms of propaganda and disinformation and all kinds of information warfare that exists at the content level. So adding what Aaron said about the infrastructure, it's also important to note that their propaganda machine is up and running, and it's not just around Ukraine, but also exploiting different kinds of political schisms across the world. Here in the United States, it was very interesting to see the trove of ads that were purchased by Russian forces and government-related individuals after and during elections. They've released those, anyone can go look at them. And what they've done is exploit things such as political divides around the Second Amendment in the United States, around racial justice, and around other kinds of politically contentious areas. And you can see that happening in Ukraine as well. So they have a long history of doing this. That's one of the reasons why blocking the propaganda media machine like Sputnik and RT, as the Council of Europe did, that happened immediately after the invasion. And you can understand why they did that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as an outside observer, the only thing I'd say is on the propaganda and information side, it looks like Ukraine, after the invasion, which is 6 months old now, seem to be doing rather well, at least in Western societies, about getting their message across versus the Russians. Is that your take on it too, Laura?
Yes, I do think they're doing a good job getting the message out. If you were going to analyze it from I hate to use this term, but a public relations campaign approach, I think bringing in Western journalists, having leakiness of information in and out of Russia, between Ukraine and Russia, among families, and certainly the kinds of videos and interviews that have been done in Ukraine, I think they are getting the message out. Absolutely.
Aaron, what's your perspective on it?
Yeah, certainly that was part of it. I mean, also part of it too was that American intelligence was walking us through this in the run up to it too. Yeah, so there was no surprises along the way. They were, and I'm not sure. I think this might actually be unprecedented for the amount of information that was coming from American intelligence in the run up to the war. So we almost knew what was happening in real time, satellite imagery, all the rest of it, and also to add to that, Russia just didn't have a good story to tell. Trying to cleanse the Ukraine of Nazis or whatever it was just utter nonsense. And so you add what the Ukraine having its act together on the social media game and on its communication side, add to the fact that the Americans were so willing to give real-time intel and to discuss this in an open way, and just the straight up clumsiness of Russian messaging and having a very, very bad message to sell, because what they were doing was engaging in an aggressive war.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you that U.S. intelligence, I won't say for once, but it was an interesting surprise that they were very accurate with their intelligence, which hasn't necessarily worked that way in Afghanistan or Iraq or some of these other conflicts. So that they told what they knew, and it tended to be one step ahead of what Putin's plans were. So that definitely assisted the situation as well. We're going to come back with our guests after this message. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with our guest, Aaron Shull from the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Dr. Laura DeNardis. She is professor at Georgetown University. Laura, one of the things that's also going on is geopolitically, Russia has allied itself, for want of any other options, with China. And does this mean that they will be relying more and more, when it comes to internet matters, on Chinese expertise? Have you studied that at all?
Yes, for some time now, there have been two approaches to internet governance. If you think of this as a question of internet governance, and one has been led in the West as it's called the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. And then there has been another completely different ideological view that has a strong authoritarian bent. And China and Russia have been very aligned in that. And not surprisingly, they're coming together in a variety of ways out of this. So one is, related to supply chain issues. One is related to using the same kinds of technologies to institute controls in their own countries, systems of censorship, et cetera. But there is definitely a pushback against that from the other model, what's called the multi-stakeholder model. And I think, if anything, this entire arena of digital sanctions has helped to make that visible in a certain way. For example, how 99% of the power, and this is what's being exploited by both Russia and China, but also serving as a point of resistance and freedom, is the infrastructure. People see content, they see devices, they see an application, but 99% of the infrastructure of the internet is not visible in the same way as content. It also has drawn attention, and this is a point of resistance also against China and Russia, to the power of private companies and the privatization of governance. So we see we have the digital mediation of the public sphere, but we also have the privatization of the flow of information within that. So those are the values tensions, and those are the points of control that are often in contention.
Yeah, Aaron, what do you think of that? Is it possible to still have a basically unified internet, or is the horse out of the barn on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like our chances. The world is moving into a very precarious and very, very dangerous time. There's a fundamental difference with respect to values, and we are in a hot conflict in Europe. So we're talking about ones and zeros in cyberspace, but what provoked this conversation is the fact that there's a ground war in Europe right now. So I do not like our chances of aligning with the Russians on just about anything. And the fact that they're liaising closely with the Chinese means that we're very quickly seeing the world push into two camps: liberal democratic societies and authoritarian ones.
Do you think that the war on Ukraine, given the lack of success on some of the cyber warfare that the Russians have always tried to do. Is that, do you think that that has given them a second thought on some of the effectiveness of this, or is that just wishful thinking?
Well, I think, effectiveness in both the war itself. I mean, certainly it's 6 months in and it's grinding, and Russia's taking heavy losses, and the secret is out in Russia too. People know what's going on. Yeah, so there's that suite of issues. But then on the cyber side, sure, the EU, the US, and NATO are active in this space. And I would note that the EU actually activated its cyber rapid response teams in the Ukraine, right? So the game is on here, right? So cyber defenses are going up, cyber capabilities are going up to match as well.
Laura, last word for you. Is there some hope here that the West can allow for better effective results than what the Russians would like?
I think the multi-stakeholder internet governance model and the success of that is actually holding. If you look at how ICANN and also the IP address RIPE NCC control body in that region, how they decided to not cut off the internet. What if they had cut it off? Then that would have opened up a geopolitical possibility for any country being cut off at any time. And I don't think that that would be good for the future of the internet. So I would say that we have a lot of concerns around fragmentation of the internet, but also that the multi-stakeholder governance model in some ways is holding.
I would like to thank our guests for being on this very interesting program, The Digital Iron Curtain. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
You very much.
Really interesting discussion with our guests on the digital divide, how it's happening. Lots going on with the war in Ukraine on the ground, but also in cyberspace. Thanks for watching today.